I bought my grandfather's waterfront lot with my own money. Then the HOA president decided my boat didn't belong there. She sent tow trucks. She sent lies. For 3 months, I lost my dock, my peace, my sanity. 6 weeks later, everything I owned was laid out on a courthouse table. Turns out my deed was older than her entire HOA, and harbor police were already on their way to her house. This is how Karen Vance learned who actually owned the water. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 38, a marine surveyor, and I raised my son Eli mostly alone since his father moved to Ohio. I grew up spending summers on my grandfather Walt's dock in Bayshore Cove, learning to tie bowlines before I could tie my shoes. When Walt passed, he left me the lot, the dock, and his old cabin cruiser, Sea Glass. Bayshore Cove Estates became a gated HOA community in 1998, decades after Walt bought his half-acre of waterfront directly from the county in 1971. His deed included a private dock easement and river access that predated any covenant. I moved into his cottage 2 years ago, docked Sea Glass where he always had, and figured that history would matter. I was wrong. The HOA at Bayshore Cove ran on newsletters, fines, and Karen Vance, who'd been board president for 6 years and treated the position like a monarchy. Neighbors joked about her clipboard patrols, her measuring tape for mailbox height, her citations for grass a 1/4 inch too tall. People laughed about it at barbecues, then quietly paid the fines so she'd leave them alone. Karen's husband Gary was a real estate attorney who drafted half the HOA's paperwork, which meant nobody on the board ever challenged her interpretations of the bylaws. Her daughter Presley, 17, rarely spoke at meetings and always looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. I didn't think much about the Vance family beyond their reputation for being intense. My first season back, Karen introduced herself at the mailbox kiosk, complimenting my cute little boat in a tone that suggested it was anything but a compliment. She asked, almost too casually, whether I'd gotten my dock permit updated with the association. I told her Walt's easement predated the HOA and didn't require their permit. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did. Over the following weeks, small notices started appearing in my mailbox. Trash bins out too early. Grass clippings on the shared path. A wind chime exceeding decorative guidelines. None were about the boat yet, but each one felt like a probe, like Karen was testing which rules I'd fight and which I'd swallow to keep the peace. I asked around and learned Karen had pushed out 2 previous residents over disputes nobody could quite explain. A retired teacher who'd painted her shutters the wrong blue, and a young couple who'd installed a hot tub without aesthetic board approval. Both families sold and left within a year. Neighbors called it bad luck. I started calling it a pattern. Tom Baxter, a board member and one of the few people willing to speak plainly, warned me over the fence one evening. She doesn't lose, he said. Doesn't matter if she's right. She just outlasts people. I laughed it off then, still new enough to think reasonableness would win out over stubbornness in the end. Linda Ashford, the HOA treasurer, ran the books alongside Karen and rarely disagreed with her in public. I noticed the budget reports at meetings were vague: landscaping services, maintenance reserve, numbers that never quite added up to anything specific. Nobody questioned it. Where questioning meant becoming her next project. Sea Glass sat at my dock exactly where Walt always kept her. Nose toward open water. Lines coiled the way he taught me. She wasn't fancy, 22 feet of fiberglass and stubborn engine. But she was mine, paid off, insured, and legally moored on land I owned outright. I didn't think a boat could become a battlefield. I was about to find out. The first HOA newsletter mentioning unauthorized vessels arrived in early spring, tucked between reminders about pool hours and a bake sale. It didn't name me directly, but the description, non-compliant hull length exceeding 20 feet at private waterfront lots, fits sea glass precisely. I reread it twice, feeling the particular chill of being talked about without being named. I called the county clerk's office out of habit more than worry, just to confirm my deed's original language. The clerk read it back to me. Waterfront parcel, granted 1971, includes perpetual dock and mooring rights, recorded before any subsequent covenant restrictions. I thanked her, hung up, and told myself the paperwork alone would end this before it started. Karen's next move was subtler. She began walking her dog past my dock every evening at exactly 6. Phone raised, filming sea glass from different angles. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was documenting community aesthetics for the newsletter. I told her my dock wasn't community property. She said, "We'll see about that," and kept filming. Presley caught my eye once during one of these walks, mouthing something I couldn't quite make out before her mother called her name sharply. It was brief, easy to dismiss as teenage awkwardness, but something about it stuck with me, like she was trying to warn me about something she couldn't say out loud. At the spring HOA meeting, Karen stood at the podium and announced a vessel compliance initiative targeting boats she claimed violated size and appearance standards. She didn't look at me once while she said it, which somehow made it worse. Several neighbors shifted in their seats. Tom caught my eye and shook his head slightly, like he already knew where this was headed. After the meeting, Gary Vance approached me in the parking lot, all warm handshake and rehearsed sincerity. "Karen just wants everyone following the same rules," he said. "It'd be so much easier if you just moved the boat to the marina." I told him my deed predated the rules. He smiled thinly.
"Deeds get interpreted."
3 days later, an official HOA violation notice arrived by certified mail. It cited Sea Glass for exceeding permitted vessel dimensions and improper waterfront storage, demanding removal within 14 days or facing a $200 daily fine. I read it twice on my porch steps, Eli peering over my shoulder asking what it meant. I told him it meant a fight was starting. I called Karen directly, hoping a calm conversation could clear this up before it escalated. She answered clipped and businesslike, insisting the board had unanimously adopted the new vessel policy. When I asked which meeting that vote happened in, she paused half a second too long before saying, "It's documented. You'll get the minutes." The minutes never came. Over the next week. And each time Linda Ashford told me they were still being finalized. In 6 years of Bayshore Cove newsletters, I'd never once seen minutes take longer than 3 days to circulate. Something about the delay felt less like bureaucracy and more like construction. I drove to the county recorder's office and pulled a certified copy of Walt's original 1971 deed, the one establishing the parcel's dock and mooring easement. I mailed it to the HOA board with a polite letter explaining that my waterfront rights predated their covenants and were therefore not subject to vessel restrictions. I thought that would settle things cleanly. Karen's response came not by letter but by a second, harsher violation notice, now citing unauthorized dock encroachment on association-managed shoreline, language that hadn't appeared anywhere before. It was as if she'd read my deed and simply invented a new rule to route around it. Gary's law office letterhead sat neatly at the bottom. Eli, sharper than his 16 years should allow. Pulled up the HOA's public bylaws online and found no mention of association-managed shoreline anywhere in the recorded covenants. Mom, he said, I think she's just making stuff up as she goes. I wanted to disagree with him. Couldn't. At the neighborhood coffee cart the following Saturday, 2 other residents quietly told me Karen had targeted their boats years earlier too, both times backing down only after they paid steep settlement fees directly to the HOA's discretionary fund. Neither had a deed like mine. Neither had fought back boats to save the aggravation. That detail nagged at me for days. A discretionary fund that fines flowed into, controlled entirely by Karen and Linda, with no itemized public accounting. I started keeping a folder. Notices, letters, screenshots of newsletters, dates and times of every interaction. I didn't know yet what I was building toward, but instinct told me to document everything. Karen escalated to phone calls at odd hours. Always about compliance updates. Always ending with a soft threat about liens on my property if fines went unpaid. I recorded one call on my phone after the 3rd time she called past 9 at night. Her tone on that recording was colder than anything printed in a newsletter. I finally hired a real estate attorney, Marcus Whitfield, recommended by the county clerk herself as someone who'd handled HOA overreach cases before. He reviewed my deed, Karen's notices, and the mysteriously absent meeting minutes, and told me plainly, this isn't a rules dispute. This looks like someone abusing a title she was never legally granted the authority to abuse. Marcus drafted a formal response letter citing my recorded easement and demanding the HOA cease enforcement against my property, along with production of the actual board vote authorizing the vessel policy. We sent it certified mail. For 9 days, silence. Then Karen requested an emergency board session, closed to general residents, scheduled with less than 24 hours notice. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Tom Baxter texted me afterward, furious. Karen had apparently told the board that my hostile legal threats endangered the association's finances and pushed through a motion authorizing immediate removal of non-compliant vessels by association contracted services. Tom said he voted no. He was the only one. Association Contracted Services turned out to be a towing company I'd never heard of, Coastal Ruiz Marine Towing, listed with a P.O. box instead of a physical address. When I mentioned the name to Tom, he went quiet for a second before saying he thought Karen's brother-in-law ran a towing business somewhere nearby. Neither of us could confirm it yet, but the coincidence sat heavy. I brought the tow company's name to Marcus, who ran a quick business registration search. Coastal Ruiz Marine Towing was registered under a Dale Ruiz, and Dale Ruiz, according to Karen's own decade-old wedding announcement still archived online, was her sister's husband. The HOA's official towing contractor was family. Nobody had disclosed that to the board or the residents. Marcus said conflict of interest contracting like that likely violated the HOA's own governing documents, which required competitive bidding for any vendor over a certain dollar threshold. I asked how anyone would prove Karen skipped that process. He said, the minutes would show it, if they existed. We both understood exactly why they didn't. Karen mailed a final notice demanding sea glass be removed within 72 hours or she'd authorize the tow at owner's expense. Per emergency board resolution, I called Marcus in a panic. He told me to do nothing rash, to let her make the move, because an illegal tow attempt on a deeded, non-HOA jurisdiction property would be the strongest evidence we could ask for. That night I sat on my dock with Eli, watching the tide pull gently at Sea Glass's hull, and told him what Marcus said. Eli asked if I was scared. I told him the truth, that I was a little, but also that Grandpa Walt hadn't fought the county for this land just so someone could bully me off it decades later. The 72 hours passed without a tow truck. Instead, Karen posted a community-wide email accusing me of threatening legal retaliation against volunteer board members and endangering neighborhood safety standards by keeping an oversized vessel docked illegally. Several neighbors I barely knew started giving me sideways looks at the mailbox kiosk. Reputation, I was learning, could be weaponized just as easily as paperwork. Presley found me alone by the community mailboxes a few days later, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "My mom's not going to stop," she said quietly. "She never stops once she decides someone's the problem." I asked why she was telling me this. She just shook her head and walked off before I could ask anything else. I started noticing Karen's dog-walking route had changed, now looping past my dock twice a day instead of once, always slowing at the same angle. Phone raised. I installed a small waterproof camera on my boathouse, less out of paranoia and more because Marcus suggested documentation would matter more than my memory eventually would in a hearing. The camera paid off within a week. Footage showed Karen approaching Sea Glass directly, running her hand along the hull, photographing the registration numbers, and, most damning, attempting to loosen one of the dock cleats before catching herself and glancing around to see if anyone was watching. She hadn't seen the camera tucked under the eave. I sent that clip to Marcus immediately. He called it borderline tampering and said it strengthened any harassment claim significantly. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than dread, a small, sharp flicker of the advantage shifting, even slightly, in my direction. I didn't celebrate, escalated when cornered. Sure enough, 2 mornings later, Sea Glass's bow line was found loosely retied in a knot Walt never taught me. Sloppy, amateur, nothing like the secure hitch I always used. Nothing was stolen. But the boat had drifted a foot off the dock overnight, close enough to the pilings to have scraped the hull if the tide had shifted wrong. My camera had caught nothing that night. A raccoon, ironically, had knocked the unit's angle askew hours earlier. I couldn't prove who retied that line, but I didn't need proof to feel it in my gut. I resecured Sea Glass myself at midnight, hands shaking with anger more than fear, and repositioned the camera before sunrise. At the next general HOA meeting, I stood up during public comment and calmly read aloud the timeline of events, the vague minutes, the family-connected tow company, the dock camera footage of someone tampering with my property. The room went silent in a way that felt different from before. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances toward Karen. Karen didn't deny anything specific. Instead, she pivoted, accusing me of surveilling a private citizen and threatening to file a restraining order for harassment via camera equipment. Gary stood beside her nodding solemnly, as if my own defense against her actions had somehow become the aggression. I felt the room's sympathy wobble uncertainly between us. Tom spoke up from the board table, voice steady. Karen, residents are allowed to install security cameras on their own property. That's not surveillance of you. That's someone protecting a boat you've tried to tow twice. Karen's jaw tightened. For the first time in 6 years, someone on her own board had contradicted her publicly, in front of everyone. After the meeting, Linda pulled me aside near the parking lot, glancing back toward the clubhouse doors. "I'm not saying anything," she whispered, "but you should ask for a full accounting of the discretionary fund. Just look into it." Then she walked away quickly, without waiting for a response, leaving me more unsettled than reassured. I filed a formal records request the next morning, citing the HOA's own bylaws requiring financial transparency to members upon written petition. Marcus said associations often stalled these requests for weeks, hoping residents would give up. I told him I had no intention of giving up. Something in Linda's warning had lit a fuse I couldn't ignore. Karen's counterattack came fast. A new notice arrived citing sea glass for excessive noise pollution, alleging I ran the engine late at night disturbing neighbors, despite the fact I hadn't started the boat in over 2 weeks, something my dock camera timestamps could easily prove. The fabrication was almost lazy, like she was testing how far she could stretch reality before someone pushed back. I forwarded the noise complaint alongside my camera logs to Marcus, who began compiling a formal harassment file for what he called a pattern of retaliatory and fabricated enforcement actions. He warned me this kind of case could take months to resolve through the association's internal appeals process before ever reaching a courtroom, if it needed to at all. Eli started keeping his own tally on our kitchen whiteboard, half joking, half genuinely angry on my behalf. A running list titled Karen's Lies, with dates and descriptions. Seeing it there each morning while I made coffee was oddly comforting. A reminder that this wasn't in my head, that the pattern was as obvious to a teenager as it was to me. Word had clearly spread through the neighborhood, because a woman named Priya, 3 docks down, knocked on my door one evening holding a manila folder of her own. Years earlier, Karen had fined her family over a non-compliant fence stain, ultimately forcing them to repaint twice at their own expense despite matching approved HOA color codes both times. Priya's story matched the pattern precisely: vague rule citations, mysteriously vanished meeting minutes, pressure to pay quickly rather than dispute. She told me she'd always assumed it was just her bad luck with Karen. Hearing my situation made her wonder, for the first time, whether it had never been about rules at all, but about control. I began quietly compiling similar stories from other residents. Tom mentioned 2 more families who'd left the community abruptly after conflicts with Karen, both selling at a loss rather than fighting. None had kept documentation like I had. None had a deed that predated the HOA's authority. I realized, uncomfortably, that I might be the first resident with the paperwork to actually win. Marcus suggested we request a formal title search cross-referencing the HOA's original 1998 covenant filing against county land records, to establish definitively which waterfront parcels, if any, had been legally exempted from HOA jurisdiction at formation. The results would take a few weeks. In the meantime, Karen showed no signs of slowing her campaign against me. A community safety flyer appeared in every mailbox days later, warning of unregistered watercraft posing fire and flood hazards. Sea Glass's model conspicuously described in the fine print. Didn't name me, but everyone who read it knew exactly whose boat it meant. My neighbor's polite nods at the mailbox kiosk grew fewer and further between. Presley approached me again, this time slipping a folded note into my mailbox instead of speaking directly. It read simply, "Check the reserve fund landscaping invoices. Compare vendor names." I stared at that note for a long time before locking it inside my document folder. Unsure yet what it meant, certain only that it mattered. I brought Presley's note to Linda, carefully, without naming the source. Linda's face went pale before she quietly admitted that several landscaping invoices over the past 3 years had been paid to a company registered under Karen's maiden name. She said she'd assumed it was a coincidence until now. I didn't think it was a coincidence at all. Marcus, upon hearing this, said it sounded less like an HOA dispute and more like potential embezzlement, a matter that could eventually involve the county district attorney's office rather than just civil court. He cautioned patience. We needed hard documentation, not suspicion, before making any accusation that serious. I agreed, though patience had never felt harder to practice. The tension in the neighborhood became its own kind of exhausting weather system. Some residents avoided eye contact entirely, worried about becoming Karen's next target for being seen talking to me. Others, quietly, started leaving supportive notes in my mailbox alongside violation notices. Small folded papers reading things like, "We see what she's doing," and nothing more. I kept Sea-Glass docked exactly where she'd always been, refusing to give Karen the satisfaction of watching me move her preemptively. Every morning I checked the lines myself before coffee, checked the camera footage from overnight, and logged anything unusual in my folder. It had become a routine as steady and grim as brushing my teeth. Karen requested, and received, an HOA attorney consultation billed to the association, Gary's own firm, naturally, regarding enforcement options against non-compliant waterfront residents. The invoice, forwarded to me anonymously by someone on the board I still hadn't identified, showed Karen's husband billing the community association nearly $4,000 to advise against his own wife's targets. Marcus called that arrangement a textbook conflict of interest, likely voidable under most HOA governing documents' self-dealing provisions. He added it to our growing file, now thick enough that he'd started keeping it in its own dedicated binder rather than a folder. "This isn't a dock dispute anymore, Nora," he told me. "This is a pattern of institutional abuse." At the following board meeting, Tom formally requested a full financial audit of the HOA's reserve and discretionary funds, citing resident concerns about vendor transparency. Karen dismissed the request as unnecessary and disruptive, but for the first time, 2 other board members quietly seconded Tom's motion. Passed narrowly, 4-3, with Karen visibly furious. The audit was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Giving Karen time, I realized later, too late to stop it, to potentially cover her tracks. In the meantime, her focus on me sharpened rather than softened, as though she sensed the walls closing and needed one clean, public victory to reassert her authority before the accounting began. A registered letter arrived from Gary's law office, this time addressed formally to Nora Callahan, owner of record, alleging Sea-Glass constituted an
attractive nuisance and demanding immediate dry dock relocation or facing association-authorized removal at the resident's sole financial liability.
Marcus responded point by point, dismantling each claim and reattaching, for the third time, certified copies of my 1971 deed and easement. He closed the letter with an explicit warning. Any attempt to physically remove or tow the vessel from privately deeded, non-HOA jurisdiction property would constitute unlawful conversion and trespass, with damages pursued accordingly. Karen didn't respond to Marcus directly. Instead, the following week, a coastal Ruiz Marine towing truck idled slowly past my street twice in one afternoon, driver clearly scouting the dock's access road. I filmed it from my porch, hands steady despite the anger coursing through me, and sent the footage straight to Marcus's office within the hour. That evening, Eli asked if we should just move Sea Glass to the public marina to avoid the whole mess. I understood the instinct. He was scared, and moving felt like safety. But I told him the truth. If I moved her now, Karen would call it an admission, a win, and she'd do this to the next family too. Priya, Tom, and two other residents formed an informal group, quietly sharing information and comparing notes on Karen's history. Someone found an old local news archive from a different state, a brief 2016 article about an HOA president named Karen Reyes, resigning amid allegations of financial irregularities before quietly relocating. Karen's maiden name, we soon confirmed, was Reyes. Marcus flagged that discovery immediately, noting that a documented prior pattern of similar conduct, even in another jurisdiction, could be relevant to establishing intent if this ever escalated to fraud charges. It wasn't proof of anything happening here yet, but it reframed everything. This wasn't Karen's first HOA, and it apparently hadn't ended well the last time either. I found myself lying awake some nights turning it all over. How someone could rebuild a reputation of quiet menace twice in one lifetime. How many families across 2 states had quietly packed up and left rather than fight. I thought about Walt, about the deed he'd fought the county for decades ago, and felt something harden in my resolve. Karen's public tone shifted subtly at the next community coffee social. Warmer, almost conciliatory, telling neighbors she just wanted what was best for everyone's property values. A few people softened toward her again, the way people do when charm is offered freely enough. I recognized it now for what it was: recalibration, not remorse. Behind that warmth, the pressure campaign against me continued privately. An anonymous complaint alleged Sea Glass was leaking fuel into shared waterways, triggering an actual county environmental inspection. The inspector found nothing. Sea Glass's tank and lines were clean, recently serviced, but the visit cost me an afternoon, a small fee, and another entry in my folder. The inspector, an older man named Hal, mentioned offhand that this was the 3rd such complaint he'd fielded against Bayshore Cove waterfront residents in 2 years, all eventually unfounded, all traced back to the same association address. He said it almost apologetically, like he already suspected the pattern but had no authority to act on suspicion alone. I gave Hal's name to Marcus, who added it to our expanding witness list. The file now included a dock camera log, a fabricated noise complaint, a tampering incident, a conflict of interest towing contract, questionable landscaping invoices, a self-dealing legal billing arrangement, and a pattern of fabricated safety complaints. Marcus called it one of the more thorough harassment cases he'd seen. For a strange stretch of about 2 weeks, everything went quiet. No new notices. Karen even waved once from her porch. a gesture so ordinary it almost felt disorienting after months of tension. I let myself breathe a little, though some cautious part of me refused to fully relax. Eli noticed the calm too, cautiously optimistic in the way teenagers can be when they want a problem to simply be over. He started sleeping better, stopped adding new entries to his whiteboard tally, even joked that maybe Karen had run out of rules to invent. I wanted to believe him. Part of me almost did. Priya told me during one of our porch conversations that Karen had been unusually absent from her usual dog walking route, and that Gary's car had been gone most mornings that week. Rumors circulated that they were dealing with a family matter. Nobody knew what that meant, and for once, nobody in the neighborhood seemed inclined to gossip about it. The scheduled financial audit crept closer, now just 4 weeks away, and Tom mentioned in passing that Karen had requested a postponement citing personal circumstances. The board granted a 2-week extension, a small concession that in hindsight gave her more room to maneuver than any of us realized at the time. Presley left another note in my mailbox during this quiet stretch, shorter than the last. She's planning something for the audit week. Be ready. No further explanation. I read it 3 times on my porch steps, the calm of the previous weeks suddenly feeling less like peace and more like the pressure drop before a storm. I brought the note to Marcus, who cautioned that we couldn't act on vague warnings from a minor without more specifics, but agreed it was wise to be extra vigilant around the audit timeline. He suggested I install a second camera angle covering the road access to the dock, not just the water side. I did so within the week. Sea glass sat undisturbed through this stretch. Lines secure, hull clean, engine untouched. I started taking her out on short evening rides again, something I hadn't done in weeks out of caution, letting Eli steer while I watched the shoreline pass, trying to remember what it felt like before any of this started. One evening on the water, Eli asked if I thought Karen would actually go through with towing the boat, given everything Marcus had warned her about. I told him honestly that I didn't know, but that people who built their whole identity around control rarely back down gracefully, even when backing down was clearly the smarter choice. Tom mentioned during a casual driveway conversation that Karen had been unusually quiet at the last 2 board submeetings, letting Linda run most of the discussion. He said it felt less like retreat and more like someone conserving energy, the way a storm system stalls offshore before making landfall with everything it's been gathering. The audit's 2-week extension came with a new requirement Karen herself proposed, that all financial records be reviewed by an independent accountant she personally recommended. Tom pushed back, insisting on a truly independent, board-selected auditor instead. After a tense vote, his version won, 5-2. Karen's control over the process was slipping visibly now. I noticed Karen's demeanor at the mailbox kiosk shift again. Less warmth, more clipped nods. The easy performance from a few weeks earlier gone. Priya said she'd overheard Karen on the phone near the community pool, voice sharp, saying something about handling it before anyone starts asking real questions. Neither of us knew exactly what it meant yet. Marcus received the completed title cross-reference report during this window, definitively confirming what we'd believed all along. My parcel's 1971 deed included recorded perpetual dock and mooring rights explicitly exempted from any future HOA covenant restriction, a status shared by only 2 other waterfront lots in the entire community, both long since sold to absentee owners. That report meant Sea Glass had never, legally, been subject to any vessel compliance rule Karen invented. Every notice, every fine, every threat had been built on nothing. Marcus said we now had everything needed to not just defend against a tow attempt, but to pursue damages for harassment and wrongful enforcement. If it came to that, I didn't celebrate the report so much as feel a steadiness settle into my chest for the first time in months. Whatever Karen was planning for audit week, I now understood, would collide directly with paperwork she could no longer talk her way around. The quiet before the next storm felt, finally, like it might favor me. The calm broke on a Tuesday morning when I found a bright orange sticker plastered across C-Glass's windshield reading Notice of Impound. Remove within 48 hours. Stamped with a seal that looked official but matched no county or HOA letterhead I'd ever seen. My camera had caught nothing overnight. Someone had approached from the waterside, out of frame. Marcus examined a photo of the sticker and confirmed immediately it wasn't a real municipal or HOA authorized notice. The seal was a poorly copied graphic. The impound authority listed didn't exist in any county registry. It was intimidation dressed as officialdom, designed to scare me into moving the boat before anyone checked its legitimacy. I peeled the sticker off carefully, preserving it in a plastic sleeve for the file, and reported the incident to the local sheriff's non-emergency line as potential harassment and impersonation of official signage. The deputy who came out took photos, noted the fake seal, and told me impersonating municipal authority could itself carry criminal penalties. Karen, when confronted at the next informal gathering by an emboldened Tom, denied any knowledge of the sticker entirely, suggesting it was probably kids messing around. Nobody in the group believed her, but nobody could prove otherwise yet either. The deniability was, I was starting to realize, the entire architecture of how she'd operated for years. That same week, an anonymous letter circulated to select mailboxes, not the whole community, just a targeted dozen, alleging I'd been verbally abusive toward board members and questioning whether I was fit to raise a teenager in the neighborhood. It was unsigned, but the phrasing echoed Karen's newsletter voice almost exactly. Eli found a copy in a friend's mailbox and brought it home white-faced, more hurt by the personal attack than anything else Karen had thrown at us. Watching him read those words about himself broke something protective open in me. This had stopped being about a boat months ago. Now it was about my son. I called Marcus that night, voice shaking with an anger I usually kept controlled, and told him I wanted to move faster, file something, anything, to stop the personal attacks before they escalated further. He talked me down gently, reminding me that emotional reactions, however justified, could weaken a carefully built case if I moved too soon. Instead, we drafted a cease and desist specifically addressing defamatory statements about my parenting and character, sent directly to Karen and, separately, to the full HOA board, establishing a clear paper record that these attacks had been formally identified and objected to. Marcus said documentation, not confrontation, remained our strongest weapon. Presley found me by the mailboxes again days later, visibly shaken herself this time. She wrote that letter, she whispered. I saw the draft on her laptop. I'm sorry, I should have warned you sooner. I told her gently that none of this was her fault, and asked if she'd be willing to say that to someone official. Eventually. She hesitated, then nodded. Marcus said a minor's willing testimony, corroborated by other evidence, could be powerful if handled carefully and appropriately through proper channels, likely involving her own legal guardian or, given the family conflict, potentially a court-appointed advocate. He cautioned we weren't there yet, but that Presley's courage mattered more than she probably understood. The independent auditor's initial preliminary findings arrived quietly to the board 2 weeks ahead of full schedule, flagging irregularities requiring further documentation in the landscaping and discretionary fund line items, the exact categories Presley's early note and Linda's confession had pointed toward months earlier. Karen was informed of the flag the same afternoon. By that evening, Karen had scheduled an emergency all-resident meeting for the following night, framing it in the community app as an urgent vessel safety and community standards discussion. Tom texted me immediately, worried this was less about safety and more about controlling the narrative before the audit findings became public. I attended that meeting with Marcus by my side for the first time, both of us seated near the back, watching Karen work the room with practiced warmth despite the tension visibly running beneath her composure. She opened by reiterating vague community safety concerns, never once mentioning the audit or its preliminary findings. When public comment opened, Tom stood and asked directly whether the emergency meeting had been called in response to the auditor's preliminary flags. Karen's composure cracked for just a second, a flicker of genuine alarm, before she recovered, insisting the meeting was entirely separate and accusing Tom of trying to distract from real safety issues. Marcus, invited by me to speak as counsel, calmly informed the room that my property's waterfront rights were legally established, deed-verified, and entirely outside HOA jurisdiction, and that continued enforcement attempts against Seaglass could expose the association to legal liability. Several neighbors who'd been quietly skeptical of Karen for months finally began nodding openly. Karen's response was to accuse Marcus, and by extension me, of bullying a volunteer board with expensive legal intimidation, painting herself once more as the beleaguered protector of community standards against outside aggression. It was a well-worn tactic by now, and I watched it work on maybe a third of the room. Same as always, but something had shifted. Arms crossed, expressions unmoved by the performance they'd apparently seen too many times before. Priya stood and calmly recounted her own years-old fence dispute, drawing a direct line between Karen's tactics then and Karen's tactics now. The room's temperature changed noticeably. Karen adjourned the meeting abruptly, citing time constraints, though it had run barely 30 minutes. As people filed out, I caught Gary pulling her aside near the exit, both of them speaking in urgent, hushed tones I couldn't quite make out. Whatever they were planning next, it clearly wasn't going to wait for another scheduled meeting. 2 nights later, my new road-facing camera caught Dale Ruiz's tow truck parked at the neighborhood entrance for nearly 40 minutes after midnight, engine idling, no visible reason for the stop. I sent the footage immediately to Marcus and the sheriff's non-emergency line, documenting the timestamp alongside everything else building in the file. Marcus warned me this looked like reconnaissance, scouting the route, timing the gate access, testing whether anyone would notice a truck idling that late. He recommended I temporarily park a car partially blocking the dock's road access, a minor but legal obstruction that would force any tow attempt into a slower, more visible process. I followed his advice, parking my sedan at an angle across the gravel access path each night, feeling faintly ridiculous doing so but grateful for anything that bought time. Eli started sleeping with his phone charged fully every night, Camera app ready. Quietly appointing himself a second set of eyes without me ever asking him to. The auditor's fuller preliminary report reached the board formally the following week, now specifying nearly $11,000 in discretionary fund payments routed to a landscaping vendor, registered under Karen's maiden name, alongside Gary's $4,000 consultation, invoice never properly disclosed or competitively bid, as required by the HOA's own governing documents. Tom called an emergency board session independent of Karen's authority, using a bylaw provision allowing any 3 board members to convene one without presidential approval. Linda, now visibly desperate to distance herself, and a third member, Renata, formally requested Karen's temporary suspension pending full audit completion. The vote passed 3-1, with Karen recused. Karen did not accept suspension quietly. She released a lengthy community-wide email calling the vote an illegal coup orchestrated by outside legal pressure from residents more interested in personal vendettas than community welfare. She never once addressed the actual audit findings, a silence louder than anything she wrote in that email. Presley, watching her mother's world visibly cracking, finally agreed to speak with Marcus directly, under her own initiative, about what she'd witnessed regarding the landscaping invoices and the falsified meeting minutes. Marcus treated her carefully, respectfully, documenting her account with the appropriate protections given her age, promising her nothing beyond honesty and process. What Presley described matched everything we'd pieced together and added new detail. Karen kept a second, unofficial set of meeting notes at home, edited before official minutes were ever released to the board, sometimes days or weeks after votes had supposedly happened. The vessel compliance policy vote, Presley said plainly, had never actually occurred. Marcus called that revelation potentially decisive. A fabricated board vote authorizing enforcement action against my property wasn't just a policy dispute anymore. It edged into territory of fraud, misrepresentation, and potentially criminal falsification of association records, depending on how the district attorney's office chose to view it once formally notified. Karen, suspended but not yet removed, still had access to the HOA's shared digital drive for another several days before the board formally revoked her credentials. In that window, several older financial documents mysteriously vanished from the shared folder, though thankfully Linda, hedging her own exposure, had already downloaded backup copies weeks earlier. Linda finally came forward fully, meeting with Marcus and, separately, the auditor, explaining that Karen had directed her for years to categorize personal and family-related payments under generic landscaping and maintenance line items, promising Linda a cut of the efficiency savings in exchange for her silence and cooperation. The picture assembling itself was larger than anyone in the neighborhood had imagined. Years of quietly skimmed discretionary funds, a self-dealing legal contract, a fabricated vessel policy vote, a family-connected towing company positioned to profit from enforcement actions Karen manufactured herself. My boat had never been the actual point. It had been leverage, a means to an end. I sat with that realization for a long time one evening on the dock, sea glass rocking gently beside me. All those months of fear and fatigue hadn't been about a wooden hull or a deed technicality at all. They'd been collateral damage from someone building and protecting a small, corrupt kingdom, one intimidated resident at a time. Karen, formally notified of her suspension's continuation pending a full board removal vote, did not go quietly into the process. Instead, in a move that stunned even Tom, she directed Gary to file a civil complaint against me personally, alleging tortious interference with HOA operations and demanding I cease coordinating with disgruntled board members. Marcus called the complaint thin, almost desperate, clearly filed more to intimidate and delay than with any real expectation of success. He filed a motion to dismiss within days, attaching the deed records, the audit findings, and Presley's documented account as exhibits. Karen, it seemed, was throwing anything available at the wall, hoping something would stick. The local paper, tipped off by someone in the neighborhood I never fully identified, ran a small article about financial irregularities under review at Bayshore Cove Estates HOA, careful and factual, quoting only that an independent audit was ongoing. It wasn't sensational, but it was public, and public was something Karen had never wanted this to become. Karen's public composure, so carefully maintained for years, began visibly fraying. Neighbors described tense exchanges at the community pool, sharp words at the mailbox kiosk, a version of her that no longer bothered performing warmth because the performance had stopped working on anyone paying attention. The mask, it seemed, only mattered when people still believed in it. One evening, without warning, Karen appeared at my dock uninvited, standing at the edge of my property line with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not composed control, but raw, cornered anger. "You did this," she said. "You and your little file. You think you're better than everyone here." I said nothing. I let her keep talking. She accused me of destroying a community she'd built with her own hands, insisted the landscaping invoices were misunderstandings, claimed the fabricated minutes were just how things get documented sometimes. Every sentence contradicted the one before it. I recorded none of it. I didn't need to. Presley, watching from the road, heard every word herself. "I'm not the one who fabricated a board vote," I finally said, quiet and steady. "I'm not the one who skimmed thousands of dollars meant for this neighborhood. You did that. Used to move my boat off land my grandfather owned before your HOA existed." She had no answer for that. She left without another word. Eli watched the whole exchange from our porch, and afterward asked if I was okay. I told him honestly that I was shaken, but okay, and that watching Karen finally run out of things to say had felt less like victory and more like watching someone finally face a mirror they'd been avoiding for years. The board's formal removal vote was scheduled for the following week, time to coincide with the audit's final report submission. Karen, according to Tom, had begun quietly reaching out to individual board members beforehand, offering compromises and clarifications, a last effort at the kind of one-on-one persuasion that had always worked for her before. It didn't work this time. Karen had implied, not quite directly, that supporting her removal would result in personal consequences for Renata's own property, standing in the community, an implied threat so blatant that Renata brought it straight to Marcus, adding one more entry to the growing case file against her. Marcus said this new intimidation attempt, layered on top of everything else, painted a picture of someone unable to stop even when stopping was clearly her only remaining rational option. "People like this don't de-escalate," he told me. "They only stop when something external forces them to. Usually the law." I understood that better than I wanted to. Karen, sensing the removal vote's outcome was no longer in doubt, made one final, desperate move. Late on a Thursday night, 4 days before the scheduled vote, she personally called Dale Ruiz and authorized an immediate tow of sea glass. Citing an emergency safety hazard, she alone had the authority, in her own mind, to declare. My road camera caught the tow truck's headlights turning onto our street at 11:47 p.m., far later than any legitimate service call would arrive. My parked sedan blocked the direct gravel approach, forcing the driver to maneuver slowly, buying precious extra minutes while my second camera, motion-triggered, sent an alert straight to my phone. I woke Eli immediately, both of us moving fast in the dark, and I called Marcus's emergency line while simultaneously dialing the local sheriff's dispatch, reporting an active unauthorized tow attempt on privately deeded, non-HOA property. The dispatcher, hearing the deed details, confirmed a unit and harbor patrol were already being routed toward Bayshore Cove. By the time I reached the dock in bare feet and a jacket thrown over pajamas, the tow driver, not Dale himself, but a younger employee, was already attempting to back his flatbed rig down the narrow access path toward sea glass, working under headlights and a handheld spotlight, clearly following instructions given over the phone minutes earlier. Karen stood near the truck in her robe, phone in hand, directing the driver with sharp, urgent gestures. "Just get it hooked up and move it," she said, loud enough for me to hear as I approached. "I have the authority. I'm the HOA president." The driver hesitated, glancing between her and the dock's clearly marked private property signage. "This isn't HOA land," I said, stepping fully into the truck's headlights, voice steadier than I felt. "This is my deeded waterfront property. You tow that boat, you're committing theft, and I have police already on the way." The driver's hand froze on the winch controls. Karen's face, lit harshly by her own truck's headlights, went rigid with fury. "She's lying," Karen snapped at the driver. "Ignore her." Authorized. "Hook it up now." The young driver looked genuinely uncertain for the first time, glancing at his phone as if hoping for instructions that hadn't come. In that hesitation, I heard the distant, unmistakable sound of a siren approaching from the main road. Karen heard it too. Did not retreat. Not yet. But the visible recalculation of someone realizing the ground beneath a plan had just changed shape. She stepped closer to the dock's edge, closer to sea glass, as if physical proximity alone could still salvage the outcome she'd already decided on. "Get that boat on the truck right now," she said again. Louder this time, her composure finally, fully gone. "I don't care what she says. I don't care about her paperwork. This is my community and I decide what stays." The driver, headlights washing over all of us, put both hands up and stepped back from the winch entirely. A sheriff's patrol car turned onto the street, blue and red lights sweeping across the water, closely followed by a second vehicle marked Harbor Patrol. Karen, momentarily frozen, watched both cars roll to a stop at the edge of my gravel access path, exactly where my sedan still sat blocking half the route. Deputy Reyes stepped out first, flashlight sweeping the scene, the idling flatbed, the half-lowered winch cable, Karen in her robe still gesturing towards sea glass, me standing barefoot beside my dock with Eli just behind me holding his phone up, recording everything without a word from either of us needed. Ma'am, Deputy Reyes said to Karen. Tone flat and professional. Can you explain what's happening here at midnight on private property? Karen straightened, visibly trying to reassemble her authority. I'm the HOA president. This vessel is in violation of association bylaws and I've authorized its removal. Reyes glanced toward me, then toward the dock's clearly posted private property sign. This address, Reyes said slowly, reading from something on his radio, shows recorded county deed rights predating HOA formation. You have documentation showing association jurisdiction over this specific parcel. Karen hesitated. The bylaws cover the whole community. Reyes shook his head slightly. That's not what I asked. Ma'am, I stepped forward and handed Reyes the certified copy of Walt's 1971 deed, kept folded in a waterproof sleeve inside my jacket pocket for exactly this possibility. He read it under his flashlight, nodded once, and turned to the tow driver. Sir, do not touch that vessel. This property is outside association authority. This would be an unlawful tow. The driver immediately raised both hands off the winch controls entirely, stepping back toward his cab, visibly relieved to have official confirmation ending his impossible position between two shouting adults. Karen's face, illuminated by the patrol car's spotlight, cycled rapidly through disbelief, anger, and something close to panic. You don't understand, Karen said, voice cracking now. She's been undermining me for months. She's part of a coordinated attack on the board. This is retaliation. Reyes remained unmoved, professionally patient. Ma'am, right now I'm dealing with an attempted unauthorized tow of a vessel on privately deeded property. That's the situation in front of me. Harbor Patrol Officer Danny Reyes, Deputy Reyes's cousin, as it turned out, both raised in the county, walked the dock's edge with a flashlight, cross-referencing the parcel markers against county waterway records on a tablet. He paused near the pilings, looked at the faded, hand-carved initials WC Walt had etched decades earlier, and something shifted in his expression. Callahan, he said aloud, mostly to himself. Walt Callahan's place. I told him yes. My grandfather. Danny nodded slowly. My dad used to fish off this exact dock with him back in the 70s. Walt helped my family get our first boat registered right here. The coincidence hit me like a wave, this land holding history even the police recognized. That small, unplanned connection didn't change the legal facts already firmly established. But it seemed to settle something in the responding officer's demeanor, a quiet certainty that this parcel story ran deeper and older than anything Karen's committee ever had authority over. Danny closed his tablet and turned toward Karen directly. Ma'am, this parcel's dock and mooring rights are recorded, exempted, and have been for over 50 years, he said. Directing a tow company to remove a vessel from this property, especially after being formally notified in writing of that exemption, could constitute theft and unlawful conversion. I'd strongly advise you stop directing this truck immediately. Karen looked at the driver, at Reyes, and me, at Eli still quietly recording, and something in her finally cracked open. Not remorse, not yet, but the unmistakable realization that every lever she'd pulled for years had, this time, hit nothing but air. This isn't over, she said weakly, though even she seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. Ma'am, "I need you to step back from the vessel and the dock area," Deputy Reyes said, gently but firmly guiding her back toward the road. The tow truck driver, without needing to be told twice, began retracting the winch cable and preparing to leave, muttering something about not getting paid enough for this under his breath. Gary arrived minutes later, hastily dressed, clearly summoned by a panicked phone call, and attempted to intervene with practiced legal authority, invoking association enforcement rights to the deputies. Reyes cut him off politely but firmly, informing him that association enforcement rights didn't override a recorded county deed exemption, regardless of who drafted the association's bylaws. Standing there in the flashing lights, watching Karen argue increasingly desperately with two officers who simply weren't moved by her tone or title, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight for months. Eli slipped his hand into mine, still recording with the other, and neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. Deputy Reyes informed Karen that, given the documented history of prior notices, the fabricated safety complaints on record with the county, and tonight's attempted unauthorized tow, he would be filing an official incident report that could support charges ranging from attempted theft to harassment, pending further review by the district attorney's office. Karen's protests grew quieter, not because she'd accepted anything, but because she seemed, for the first time all night, to genuinely understand that no amount of insisting on her authority was going to change the outcome unfolding in front of her. Gary stood beside her, silent now too, the practiced confidence gone from his posture. The tow truck pulled away empty just after 1 a.m., taillights disappearing down the community's main road. Karen and Gary followed shortly after, walking home in tense silence, Deputy Reyes's cruiser trailing slowly behind them for a stretch. Less an escort than a quiet, deliberate statement that this night's events were now officially on record. I stayed on the dock long after everyone left, sea glass rocking gently in the dark water beside me, lines secure, untouched, exactly where she belonged. Eli sat beside me, quiet for once, and I realized this was the first night in months I hadn't gone to bed afraid of what tomorrow's mailbox might hold. Marcus called first thing the next morning, having already heard from Deputy Reyes's incident report filed overnight. He said this changed everything, an attempted unauthorized tow, on record, following months of documented harassment and a fabricated policy vote, gave us more than enough to pursue both the removal vote and potential civil damages simultaneously. News of the midnight tow attempt spread through Bayshore Cove faster than any newsletter ever had. By mid-morning, half the neighborhood seemed to know some version of the story, and the sympathetic looks I'd grown used to over the past months finally started shifting into something closer to solidarity and, in some cases, quiet apology. Priya showed up at my door with a plate of muffins and an apology for not speaking up sooner about her own fence dispute years earlier. "I should have fought back then," she said. "Maybe it wouldn't have taken this long for someone to finally stop her." I told her there was no use in should-haves now, only in what happened next. The board's scheduled removal vote, originally set for 4 days out, was moved up by emergency motion to the following evening, citing immediate risk to community trust and legal standing following the tow incident. Even the board members who'd previously stayed neutral now seemed eager to formally close this chapter. Karen requested to address the board privately before the vote, a request Tom, now effectively leading in her absence, agreed to allow strictly on the record, with Marcus and myself present as documented parties given our formal legal involvement. Karen arrived looking smaller somehow, the practiced authority of months past visibly absent. She opened by insisting the audit findings were exaggerated, the tow attempt a misunderstanding born of genuine safety concern, and the fabricated minutes clerical errors. Nothing intentional. Nobody in the room reacted. The evidence sitting in front of everyone told a different story than the one she was still, somehow, trying to tell herself. Linda, present as treasurer despite her own complicated role in events, quietly corrected the record, confirming under Marcus's questioning that Karen had directed the invoice categorizations herself. Year after year, fully aware of where the money was actually going. I realized, the first time Linda had told the complete truth in one of these rooms. Presley, accompanied by a court-appointed advocate given her age and the family conflict involved, provided a brief written statement read into record confirming the fabricated meeting minutes and her mother's private, unofficial notes kept separately from official documentation. Karen's face, hearing her own daughter's account read aloud, finally showed something like real grief. The board voted unanimously, 6-0 with Karen abstaining by procedure rather than choice, to permanently remove her from the HOA presidency and board membership, effective immediately, pending full referral of the financial findings to the County District Attorney's Office for further review regarding potential embezzlement and fraud charges. Karen left that meeting without another word, Gary trailing behind her, both of them walking out into a parking lot full of neighbors who no longer bothered pretending not to watch. There was no triumphant applause, no dramatic scene, just a quiet, collective exhale from a community that had spent years bracing itself without fully understanding why. In the days following, the audit's final report became public record per the HOA's own transparency bylaws, detailing nearly $14,000 in misdirected discretionary funds across 3 years, alongside the self-dealing legal contract and the fabricated vessel compliance vote that had started this entire ordeal for Seaglass and me. Marcus filed the civil complaint on my behalf shortly after, formally seeking damages for harassment, attempted conversion of property, and emotional distress, naming Karen individually rather than the HOA itself, careful to ensure the broader community wasn't financially punished for one person's individual campaign against a single family. Dale Ruiz's towing company lost its status as any kind of association-adjacent vendor within days. And separately, county regulators opened their own inquiry into whether Coastal Ruiz Marine Towing had knowingly attempted an unauthorized removal without proper verification of property jurisdiction, a question with its own potential licensing consequences. Gary, facing likely disbarment proceeding scrutiny over the undisclosed self-dealing legal billing, quietly dissolved his small practice's HOA consulting arm entirely, according to Tom, who'd heard it secondhand from another attorney in town. The Vance family's carefully built local reputation was unraveling faster than any of them had likely imagined possible weeks earlier. Presley, through her advocate, was connected with extended family living 2 counties over, and Tom mentioned she'd expressed interest in finishing high school somewhere away from Bayshore Cove entirely. I hoped, whatever happened next for her, that she found a version of stability her own home clearly hadn't offered in a long time. The community held an informal gathering at the shared pavilion a few weeks later. Less a celebration and more a collective decompression. Neighbors swapping stories they'd been too afraid to share aloud for years. Priya brought muffins again. Tom brought a cooler of drinks. Someone, I never learned who, brought a small handwritten sign reading simply, "Welcome back. Normal." I brought sea glass out that evening too, tying her up at the pavilion's small public dock so anyone curious could finally see. Close. The boat that had somehow become the flashpoint for uncovering years of quiet institutional abuse. A few neighbors actually laughed, admitting she looked nothing like the hazard Karen's flyers had once described. Eli, standing at the dock's edge with a soda in hand, told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything, that watching me refuse to fold under pressure had taught him something about standing your ground. He didn't think he could have learned any other way. I told him I hoped he'd never actually need to use that lesson. The county district attorney's office formally opened an investigation into the discretionary fund misappropriation within the month, and Marcus said preliminary conversations suggested charges were likely, though the process would take time to fully unfold through the appropriate legal channels rather than the neighborhood rumor mill everyone had relied on for years. Karen and Gary listed their house for sale roughly 6 weeks after the removal vote, a for sale sign appearing quietly on their lawn without announcement or fanfare. A strange, muted end to what had once been the most visibly dominant presence in the entire community's daily life. I saw Karen once more before they moved, loading boxes into a moving truck alone, Gary nowhere in sight. She glanced toward my dock briefly, and for a moment I thought she might say something. She didn't. Boxes. And I let her have that silence, no longer needing anything more from her than distance. The new HOA board, led temporarily by Tom until formal elections could be held, adopted revised bylaws explicitly codifying waterfront parcel exemptions, competitive vendor bidding requirements, and mandatory timely minute publication, safeguards built directly from the very failures Karen's tenure had exposed, ensuring no future resident would face what I had faced alone. Priya was elected to the new board that spring, running specifically on a platform of transparency and accountability, a direct rebuke of everything Bayshore Cove had tolerated for years without quite naming it. I declined to run myself, happy enough to simply live quietly on the water again without needing a title to feel secure there. Linda resigned from the treasurer position but avoided formal charges by fully cooperating with the audit and subsequent investigation, providing documentation that ultimately strengthened the case against Karen significantly. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something closer to accountability than she'd shown in years of quiet complicity. Marcus and I began methodically preparing my civil case over the following weeks, compiling the dock camera footage, the fabricated notices, the fake impound sticker, the recorded midnight tow attempt, and Deputy Reyes's official incident report into a single, comprehensive filing meant to leave no reasonable doubt about the pattern behind Karen's actions. We requested and received the county's business registration records confirming Dale Ruiz's ownership of Coastal Ruiz Marine Towing, along with billing records showing the company had invoiced the HOA nearly $6,000 over 2 years for compliance services against residents, virtually all of it traceable back to Karen's direct instruction. Marcus said the strength of our case lay not in any single incident, but in the accumulated weight of the pattern months of fabricated notices, a forged policy vote, tampered mooring lines, false safety complaints, a fake impound sticker, and finally an attempted illegal tow, each one building on the last into something impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. I spent an evening organizing the physical documents into chronological order for the first time since Walt's original deed had started this entire fight, laying them across my kitchen table while Eli helped label folders. Seeing 11 months compressed into a stack of paper felt strange, smaller somehow than it had ever felt while living through it. Word came from the district attorney's office that formal charges were being prepared against Karen for embezzlement of association funds and fraudulent record falsification,
with a separate charge under review regarding the attempted unauthorized tow, given its overlap with both theft statutes and the harassment pattern established in Deputy Reyes's report.
Gary, according to Tom's ongoing local grapevine, had quietly reached out to several board members attempting informal settlement conversations regarding my civil complaint, hoping to resolve things before formal discovery began. Marcus advised patience, reminding me that a rushed settlement now might undervalue both the damages and the accountability this case deserved. I found myself, during this waiting period, taking sea glass out more often than I had in over a year, sometimes just puttering along the shoreline at sunset with Eli, sometimes alone, letting the engine's familiar hum replace the anxious churn that had lived in my chest for the better part of 11 months. Presley sent a short message through her advocate, thanking me for believing her notes mattered when she'd slipped them into my mailbox, unsure at the time whether anyone would ever act on them. I wrote back simply that her courage had mattered more than she'd probably ever fully know, and that I hoped her new start treated her kindly. The formal settlement offer arrived from Gary's replacement attorney roughly a month later, a figure Marcus called a reasonable opening position, but nowhere near reflective of 11 months of documented harassment. We countered significantly higher, citing legal fees, emotional distress, and the broader pattern established through the criminal investigation now running in parallel. Negotiations stretched through the following weeks, punctuated by updates from the district attorney's office confirming formal embezzlement charges had been filed against Karen, with an arraignment date set for early the following month. The criminal case, running alongside my civil claim, gave Marcus significant additional leverage in every conversation. Karen's new attorney, clearly aware of how badly a public trial would look layered on top of active criminal charges, pushed harder toward settlement, eventually landing on a figure that covered my full legal costs, the camera equipment, and a meaningful sum beyond that Marcus called a fair acknowledgement of what you went through. I signed the settlement on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Marcus's office, Eli waiting in the car outside since he'd insisted on coming along for what he called the official ending part. Walking out afterward, I felt lighter than I had in almost a year, though I knew the criminal case would still take its own time to resolve. Karen's arraignment, held 2 weeks later at the county courthouse, drew a small handful of former Bayshore Cove residents, including Priya and Tom, who'd come simply to witness the moment publicly rather than through secondhand rumor. Karen pleaded not guilty, though Marcus said the evidence against her left little realistic room for that plea to hold. I didn't attend the arraignment myself, choosing instead to spend that afternoon on the water with Eli, deciding that Karen no longer deserved my presence, my attention, or any more of the energy she'd already taken from me for nearly a year. Sea Glass's engine felt steadier that day than it had in months. Word came weeks later that Karen had accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, pleading guilty to embezzlement and record falsification in exchange for a reduced sentence involving restitution, probation, and a permanent bar from serving on any homeowners association board within the state for the remainder of her life. Marcus called the outcome appropriate. If not dramatic, restitution meant the HOA's discretionary fund would eventually be made whole. And the lifetime board ban meant no future community would face what Bayshore Cove had endured under her leadership. Sometimes, he said, justice looked less like punishment and more like structural prevention. Dale Ruiz's towing company lost its county operating license entirely following the parallel investigation into the attempted unauthorized tow. A consequence, Marcus noted, was almost incidental to my case but satisfying nonetheless. One more piece of the network that had enabled Karen's control quietly dismantled alongside everything else. I ran into Danny Reyes, the harbor patrol officer, at the Marina Supply store a few months later, and he asked how Sea Glass was doing, genuinely warm in a way that reminded me again how strange and grounding it had felt that his own family history overlapped with my grandfather's on that very dock decades earlier. He told me his father still talked about fishing off Walt's dock as a kid, and that hearing my name on that midnight call had made the whole situation feel less like routine police work and more like something worth getting right. I thanked him, genuinely, for how carefully he and Deputy Reyes had handled everything that night. Eli started spending more time on the water that summer, teaching himself the same knots Walt had taught me decades earlier, insisting on learning to dock Sea Glass properly himself instead of always riding along. Watching him coil a line the exact way I remembered my grandfather doing felt like something healing quietly closing a loop. The rebuilt HOA board, now operating under the new transparency bylaws, held its first fully public financial review meeting that fall, projector displaying every line item openly for any resident to question. It ran 2 hours longer than any meeting under Karen's presidency ever had, mostly because people finally trusted the numbers enough to actually engage with them. Priya, now serving on the board herself, told me afterward that several long hesitant residents had finally spoken up publicly about old grievances from Karen's years, encouraged by watching the process actually work as intended for the first time. It wasn't dramatic, she said, just steady, which, after everything, sounded like exactly what the community needed. I still keep Walt's original 1971 deed in a fireproof box now, alongside a printed copy for quick reference. A habit born from necessity that I doubt I'll ever fully break. Some nights I take it out just to reread his handwriting on the margin notes. Small reminders of a man who fought for this same water decades before I had to. Marcus and I stayed in occasional contact after the case closed. Mostly holiday cards and the rare update, though he joked once that Bayshore Cove had given him more HOA horror stories than the rest of his career combined. I told him I hoped, sincerely, that he never had to hear another story quite like it again. Tom eventually stepped down from the board once elections stabilized things, joking that he'd done his time getting the community through its roughest chapter. He and his wife still wave from their dock most mornings, and I've come to appreciate how much quieter, steadier decency can hold a neighborhood together when it finally gets the chance. Presley reached out once more, nearly a year after everything settled, sharing that she'd started community college 2 counties over and was doing well, living with an aunt who, she said, actually listens instead of just talking. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant every word of it completely. I think about Karen sometimes, not with anger anymore so much as a kind of tired clarity, how much energy she spent building control over a community that never actually needed controlling, how much simpler and better her years there could have been if she'd chosen almost anything else to build instead. Sea glass still sits at the same dock Walt first moored her at. Decades of family history anchored to a half-acre of waterfront that outlasted every attempt to claim authority over it that was never legally there to begin with. Some nights I sit on her deck just watching the tide, grateful for how ordinary peace can feel once you've fought hard enough to earn it back. Eli asked me once, months after everything ended, whether I regretted not just moving the boat at the very beginning to avoid the whole ordeal. I told him no, not because the fight had been easy, but because giving in would have meant letting someone rewrite the truth of who actually belonged on this water. And Walt hadn't raised me to do that. The county later cited Bayshore Cove's case. Informally, as part of updated guidance materials for new HOA board training, emphasizing transparent record-keeping and respect for pre-existing deed rights. Marcus said it was rare for a single neighborhood dispute to ripple out that far, though he wasn't surprised, given just how much documentation we'd built along the way. On the one-year anniversary of that midnight tow attempt, Eli and I took Sea Glass out for a slow evening ride, retracing the same stretch of water Walt used to take me down as a kid. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to, like the ending we'd earned. It was nearly sunset when Eli cut the engine near the old sandbar, letting Sea Glass drift lazily in the current the way Walt always used to when he wanted to let the water do the talking, as he called it. I watched the light shift gold across the surface, thinking how close I'd come to losing all of this. My phone buzzed with a message from Priya, forwarding a community update. Bayshore Cove's board had just approved a small dedication plaque for the public pavilion dock, honoring longtime waterfront families who helped preserve the community's original character. Walt's name was listed first. I read it twice before showing Eli, my throat tight. We motored back toward our own dock as the sky deepened into orange and violet. The kind of evening Walt used to say made all the mosquito bites and engine trouble worth it. I tied Sea Glass off myself, out of habit more than necessity now, checking each line twice the way I always had since that first violation notice. Inside, I pulled the fireproof document box from its shelf, not out of anxiety this time but something closer to reflection. Laying Walt's original deed beside the settlement paperwork and the county's dismissed charges list against coastal Ruiz Marine Towing. 11 months of fear had become, somehow, just a stack of paper on my kitchen table. Eli sat across from me, flipping idly through his old whiteboard photos saved on his phone. Karen's lies, the running tally he'd kept half in anger, half in disbelief. "We should print this out," he joked. "Frame it next to Grandpa's deed." I laughed for the first time in a while at something related to all of this. Later that night, a text came in from Marcus, almost casual in tone. The county's business licensing board had formally and permanently revoked Coastal Ruiz Marine Towing's operating certificate, citing the unauthorized tow attempt alongside 2 other unrelated complaints uncovered during their review. One more thread of that old, tangled web, finally cut clean. I sat on the porch a while longer after Eli went to bed, listening to the water lap gently against the dock pilings. The same sound that had once kept me awake with dread and now simply felt like home again. Somewhere down the shoreline, a neighbor's wind chime rang softly, no violation notice waiting for it in the morning. A few days later, the county clerk's office called unexpectedly, informing me that Walt's original 1971 deed language was being referenced, with my permission, in an updated public guidance document about waterfront parcel rights predating HOA formation across the county. I agreed without hesitation, thinking how much Walt would have appreciated leaving that kind of mark. Tom stopped by one afternoon with a six-pack and an update. The new board had unanimously voted to formally strike every fabricated vessel compliance rule Karen had ever
introduced from the HOA's official bylaws, restoring the original, much simpler covenant language that had governed Bayshore Cove peacefully for its first several years.
Feels almost anticlimactic, Tom admitted, cracking open a beer on my porch steps. All that chaos. And in the end, it just goes back to how things were supposed to be the whole time. I told him that sometimes justice wasn't dramatic at all. Sometimes it just looked like things quietly, finally, working correctly again. Priya mentioned during a board update that the discretionary fund, now fully restored through Karen's court-ordered restitution payments, was being used for its first legitimate community project in years, repairing the shared pavilion dock's aging pilings, the same structure where sea glass had proudly sat on display months earlier. I volunteered a Saturday to help with the pavilion dock repairs, working alongside neighbors I'd barely spoken to during the worst of the conflict, people who'd stayed quiet out of fear rather than indifference. Nobody apologized outright, but the easy, steady camaraderie of shared work said more than any formal apology could have. Eli, sanding down a weathered plank beside me, asked quietly whether I thought Karen ever really understood what she'd done, or whether people like her simply moved on to new places, new communities, new versions of the same pattern. I didn't have a clean answer for him. I still don't, if I'm honest. Marcus later mentioned, almost in passing, that Karen and Gary had relocated 3 counties over into a community with no HOA at all, an oddly fitting outcome. He said, for someone who'd spent years insisting rules existed to protect everyone, only to end up somewhere entirely free of the structures she'd once weaponized. The restitution payments arrived steadily over the following months. First to the HOA's restored discretionary fund, then eventually, per the civil settlement, a final installment closing out my own case completely. I used part of it to finally replace Sea Glass's aging engine, something Walt had been meaning to do for years before he passed. Standing at the marine shop counting out the estimate for the new engine, I found myself laughing quietly at the strange symmetry of it all. Money meant to intimidate me off this water, instead making sure Sea Glass would run smoothly on it for years to come. Walt, I thought, would have appreciated that particular irony most of all. Eli helped install the new engine that spring, hands greasy, following the mechanic's instructions with the same careful focus Walt always brought to boat work. Watching him work, sunlight glinting off the water behind him, I felt something settle fully into place, not just resolution, but continuity, the next generation learning to care for what came before them. Priya's daughter and Eli had grown close over the past year, bonding partly over shared frustration during the HOA fight and partly over simple teenage friendship. And the two of them spent that summer fixing up an old kayak together at the pavilion, laughing in a way that felt entirely disconnected from everything that had come before. The new board's first annual community picnic that summer felt different from anything Bayshore Cove had hosted in years. Genuinely relaxed. No undercurrent of who might be filming whose yard. No quiet anxiety about which conversation might end up in a violation notice. Just neighbors, actually being neighbors, for the first time in a long while. I brought Sea Glass to the picnic's small public dock again, engine humming smoothly now, and let a few curious kids climb aboard under close supervision. showing them the compass Walt had mounted decades earlier, still perfectly functional, still pointing true north exactly the way he'd calibrated it years before any of this happened. Danny Reyes stopped by the picnic off-duty, recognizing several familiar faces from that midnight call, and spent a good half-hour swapping old fishing stories with residents who remembered his father working these same waters decades earlier. It struck me again how deeply layered this community's real history ran beneath everything Karen had tried to control. Late that afternoon, as the picnic wound down, Tom raised an informal toast. Nothing official, no microphone, just a raised drink among neighbors, to getting our community back. Someone added, half joking, and to Walt Callahan's deed, best kept legal document in county history. I laughed along with everyone else, though my eyes stung a little too. I drove past Karen's old house a few weeks later, purely by coincidence, running an errand on the other side of town. New owners had already repainted the shutters a soft sage green, planted fresh flowers along the walk. Nothing left of the house's previous tenant except the bones of the structure itself. Life, quietly, moving forward. Marcus called one last time that fall, mostly just to check in, mentioning he'd started referencing our case. Anonymized. In a continuing education seminar, he occasionally taught on HOA governance and resident rights. You built one of the most thorough documentation trails I've ever seen, he said.
Most people give up long.
I told him honestly that giving up had crossed my mind more than once during those 11 months. Especially during the worst stretches when the fines kept coming and the notices felt endless. What kept me going, more than anything, was imagining explaining to Eli someday why I'd let someone bully us off land his great-grandfather fought to own. That fall, Eli started his junior year, and one of his teachers assigned a personal essay project. He wrote his, without telling me beforehand, about watching his mother refuse to back down from an unjust fight, learning firsthand that standing your ground sometimes meant enduring discomfort far longer than felt fair before things finally, actually changed. Reading that essay for the first time, sitting at our kitchen table months after everything had settled, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself feel during. The fight itself, that whatever this cost me in stress and sleepless nights, it had taught my son something about integrity that no easier outcome ever could have. The following spring, the county held a small ceremony dedicating an updated public waterway access guide, citing several long-standing waterfront easements across the region, including Walt's original 1971 parcel. I attended with Eli, standing quietly near the back as a county official briefly mentioned families whose deeded rights predate modern development pressures. It wasn't a grand recognition, no plaque with my name on it, nothing dramatic, just a quiet, official acknowledgement folded into a broader civic document. But standing there with Eli beside me, I felt Walt's presence keenly, as if some small, stubborn piece of him had finally, fully won the argument he'd started decades before either of us existed. Sea Glass turned 30 years old that summer, still running smooth on her rebuilt engine, still tied at the same dock Walt first moored her at. I marked the occasion quietly, just Eli and me, motoring out past the sandbar at sunset, the same slow ritual that had carried us through the worst and best of the past 2 years. Looking back now, I recognize how close this entire story came to ending differently, how easily I could have simply moved the boat at the very first notice, avoided the conflict, avoided the fear, avoided ever learning just how deep Karen's pattern of control actually ran beneath the surface of our seemingly ordinary community. But Walt didn't fight the county for waterfront access in 1971 just so a future HOA president could erase that history with a fabricated policy vote and a family-connected towing company decades later. Some things, I've come to believe, are worth the exhausting, uncertain fight required to protect them properly. Karen, wherever she's rebuilding her life now, 3 counties over in a community with no rules left to bend, will likely never fully reckon with the damage she caused, the families who quietly moved away, the years of quiet fear woven into an otherwise peaceful neighborhood, the trust it will take years to fully rebuild. I don't know if people like her ever really change, or if they simply find new, smaller stages once the old ones collapse beneath them. What I do know is that this particular stage, this particular half-acre of waterfront, belongs firmly and legally to me now, exactly as it always should have from the very beginning. Presley still texts occasionally, small updates about community college, a part-time job at a bookstore, a life quietly, steadily building itself away from everything Bayshore Cove had once represented for her. I hope, more than almost anything else that came out of this whole ordeal, that she finds real, lasting peace somewhere far from her mother's shadow. Tom retired fully from board work that winter, content to simply enjoy his own dock again without the weight of representing a fractured community. He still stops by occasionally, beer in hand, mostly just to talk fishing and weather, the easy, unremarkable neighborliness that Karen's presidency had slowly, quietly stolen from all of us for years. Linda moved out of Bayshore Cove entirely within the year. Unable, she told Priya once, to face the neighbors whose trust she'd helped Karen quietly erode for so long. I don't know exactly where she landed, and honestly, I've made peace with not needing to know. Some chapters simply close without a tidy final page. The auditor's full final report became something of an unofficial case study among neighboring HOAs in the county, several of whom reportedly updated their own bylaws after hearing, informally, what had happened at Bayshore Cove. Marcus said he'd fielded more than one call from other residents elsewhere asking, essentially, how do we make sure this doesn't happen to us? I told him, when he relayed those calls, that the answer was almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight: document everything. Know your deed. Never assume a title. A loan grants someone authority they were never legally given. And never, ever let fear of confrontation outweigh the cost of quietly losing what's rightfully yours. Eli, now looking ahead toward college applications, mentioned once that this whole experience had shifted something in how he thought about fairness and power, less abstract now, more concrete, rooted in watching real consequences finally catch up to real abuse of authority. I told him that lesson, learned this early, would serve him well for the rest of his life. Sea glass needed new upholstery that fall, the old vinyl finally cracking after decades of sun and salt air. I chose a deep blue fabric, close to what Walt had originally picked when he first bought her. A small act of continuity that felt right after everything the boat itself had unwittingly weathered over the past 2 years. Priya's board continued strengthening the HOA's governance structure through the following year, adding term limits for board presidents, mandatory annual third-party audits, and a clear, accessible appeals process for any resident facing enforcement action. Every safeguard traced directly back to a specific failure Karen's tenure had exposed, Painfully, but ultimately usefully, I attended one of those meetings myself, mostly out of curiosity, and watched the new board handle a minor landscaping dispute with patience, clear documentation, and genuine fairness, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable competence that had felt impossible to imagine during the worst months of fighting for my own dock and boat. Standing at the back of that meeting, watching two neighbors calmly resolve a fence line disagreement in under 15 minutes, I felt something close to closure settle fully into place. This was what the community was always supposed to look like: boring, functional, fair, before one person's need for control had quietly hijacked it for years. Walking home afterward, Eli waiting on the porch with dinner already started, I thought about how strange it was that an 11-month nightmare over a single boat had ultimately restored something far larger than just my own dock rights, an entire community's ability to trust its own governing structure again, however long that trust would take to fully rebuild. The following spring, county records confirmed Karen's restitution payments had been completed in full, closing out the last formal obligation tied to her embezzlement conviction. Marcus forwarded the notice with a short message. Officially, completely closed. Go enjoy your water. I read it twice on my porch. Sea glass rocking gently just beyond the railing. I called Eli out from inside to read it too, and we stood together for a moment in the late afternoon light, not saying much, just letting the finality of it settle over us both. 2 years of fighting, documenting, waiting, and worrying, distilled down to one short, unremarkable sentence confirming it was, at last, truly over. That evening we took Sea Glass out one more time. No particular destination in mind, just the familiar stretch of water Walt had first shown me as a child. The engine ran clean and steady. The deed sat safely locked in its fireproof box at home. And for the first time in over 2 years, nothing weighed on either of us. I thought about all the small, easily missed details that had ultimately mattered most. A folded note left quietly in a mailbox, a treasurer's uneasy conscience, a harbor officer who happened to remember my grandfather's name, a teenager's insistence on keeping a whiteboard tally nobody asked him to keep. Justice, turned out, arrived through 100 small, ordinary courage. Karen had once told me, standing furious at the edge of my dock, that this wasn't over. In the strictest sense, she was right. It took months more of audits, hearings, and legal proceedings before every thread finally closed. But she was wrong about who would still be standing on this waterfront once it did. I still keep Presley's original note in the fireproof box alongside Walt's deed. A strange but fitting pairing, one document establishing legal rights decades before any of this began, the other a scared teenager's quiet act of courage that ultimately helped bring the whole fabricated system crashing down around its architect. Eli graduated high school 2 years later, and during his commencement speech as class vice president, he mentioned, briefly and without naming anyone directly, learning that standing up to unfair authority takes patience, documentation, and people willing to tell the truth even when it's frightening. I cried harder at that line than I expected to. Sea Glass, now nearly 32 years old, still runs beautifully, still ties off at the same dock Walt first secured her to, still carries the faint, hand-carved WC on the pilings that Danny Reyes once recognized under flashlight on the worst night of this entire ordeal. Some things, thankfully, remain exactly as they should. Bayshore Cove today looks, on the surface, almost exactly like it did before any of this started. Quiet mornings at the mailbox kiosk. Kids learning to fish off the pavilion dock. Neighbors waving from their porches. But underneath that surface now sits real structural accountability. Hard won. Expensive. And, I believe, permanent this time. I think of Walt often when I'm out on the water alone, imagining what he'd say watching this whole saga unfold. Probably something dry and understated, like, told you that paperwork would matter someday. Followed by a satisfied nod and an insistence I check the bilge pump one more time before heading in. Priya eventually became board president herself, elected on a clear mandate of transparency. And she's held the position now longer than anyone since Karen, without a single formal complaint filed against her leadership. She jokes sometimes that she keeps Walt's deed language framed in her home office, just as a reminder of what happens when nobody checks. The civil settlement funds I received, combined with the restitution, ultimately paid for Sea Glass's full restoration, Eli's first semester of college textbooks, and a small emergency fund I'd never quite managed to build before all of this started. Something good, however hard-earned, had finally come from those exhausting 11 months. I ran into Karen exactly once more, entirely by accident, at a marine supply store 2 counties over, nearly 3 years after everything had concluded. She looked older, quieter, stripped of the performed authority that had once defined her every interaction. We exchanged a brief, awkward nod. Neither of us said anything. Felt right that way. Driving home afterward, I realized I felt nothing sharp anymore. No lingering anger. No need for one final confrontation or apology I knew would never come genuinely anyway. Just a quiet, settled peace. The kind that only arrives once you've completely won something you never should have had to fight for in the first place. Eli called that evening from college, asking, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd heard anything new about Karen lately. I told him about the marine supply store, the quiet nod, nothing more. He was silent for a moment before saying, "Good. I'm glad it's actually just boring now." I told him boring was exactly the point. Bayshore Cove's annual meeting that fall ran under 2 hours for the 5th consecutive year. Financial reports fully transparent. Minutes published within 48 hours as bylaws now required. No fines issued without documented. Board-approved cause. It was, by every measure that mattered, precisely the kind of unremarkable governance a community deserves. I still serve occasionally on the community's Waterfront Advisory Committee, a small, informal group formed after everything settled to help mediate future property line or dock disputes before they ever escalate toward formal enforcement. Feels like quiet, useful work, built directly from everything I wish someone had offered me back when this all started. Sea Glass's engine hummed steadily beneath me one late afternoon this past spring. Eli home for summer break beside me, both of us watching the light shift gold across the water exactly the way it had that first anniversary evening years earlier. Some rituals, I've learned, are worth protecting precisely because they almost weren't. I think sometimes about how differently this could have ended, if I hadn't kept the camera footage, if Presley had never found the courage to leave that first note, if Deputy Reyes hadn't happened to recognize a name carved into old dock pilings decades before either of us were born. So much of justice, turns out, depends on small, unlikely threads holding. But they did hold. Every single one of them, woven together slowly over 11 exhausting months into something strong enough to finally outlast Karen's need for control. Walt's deed, still safely locked away, remains the single most important piece of paper I own, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it ultimately protected. The waterfront still catches the same light it always has, indifferent to whoever claims authority over it at any given moment. Karen believed, for years, that a title and a clipboard could rewrite ownership itself. The county records, the harbor patrol, and eventually the courts all quietly, firmly disagreed with her on that point. Eli, home from college that summer, spent an afternoon teaching Priya's younger nephew how to tie the same bowline knot Walt once taught me. Patient and unhurried in a way that made me proud beyond words. Watching that small moment of inherited knowledge pass hands on the very dock where all of this began felt like the truest kind of ending. I sold nothing, moved nowhere, and kept exactly what was always legally mine from the very beginning, a half-acre of waterfront, a weathered dock, and an old boat that had somehow become, unintentionally, the proof point for an entire community's overdue reckoning with quiet institutional abuse. Some nights I still sit out on the dock long after Eli's gone to bed, listening to the water, thinking about how close fear had once come to costing me all of this. I'm grateful, every time, that I chose documentation over surrender, patience over panic, and Walt's stubborn example over the easier path of simply giving in. Karen Vance is, as far as anyone in Bayshore Cove knows now, just a name from an old, uncomfortable chapter, no longer a title, no longer an authority, no longer anything more than a cautionary story new residents occasionally hear during onboarding about why the community's bylaws now include such thorough transparency requirements. And Sea Glass still sits exactly where Walt first moored her. Decades of family history anchored firmly to a piece of waterfront no HOA president, however determined, ever actually had the legal right to touch in the first place. The following winter, Marcus sent one final update. The county's HOA Oversight Board had formally adopted a new resident rights pamphlet distributed to every association in the region, built partly from lessons learned through Bayshore Cove's case, emphasizing deed research, documentation, and the simple, powerful reminder that titles do not override recorded law. Bayshore Cove itself settled fully into its new rhythm. Board elections contested but civil. Financial reports boring in exactly the reassuring way they were always meant to be. Neighbors trusting each other again in the small, ordinary ways that had once felt impossible during Karen's years of quiet, corrosive control over daily life. Presley, now finishing her second year of college, sent a photograph that spring of herself on a small lake somewhere upstate, grinning behind the wheel of a rented pontoon boat. Captioned simply, "Learned to drive one of these because of you." I kept that photo, right alongside everything else in the fireproof box. Eli graduated college himself 2 years later, choosing a career path in environmental law, telling me plainly it started the night he watched harbor patrol lights sweep across our dock and realized paperwork, patience, and the truth could actually beat someone determined to bend both. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome from any of this. I still take Sea Glass out most weekends, sometimes alone, sometimes with Eli home visiting, sometimes with Priya and her family for slow summer evenings along the same stretch of water Walt first showed me as a child. The boat runs clean, the dock stands solid, and the water, as always, belongs to whoever the deed says it does. Bayshore Cove's story eventually became, in its own small way, a quiet cautionary tale passed between other communities in the county, proof that unchecked authority, however confidently performed, eventually meets paperwork it cannot argue with, and that patience, documentation, and a few brave, ordinary people are usually enough to outlast it. Some evenings, watching the sunset stretch gold and orange across the same water Walt fought decades ago to keep, I think about how simple this all should have been. From the very beginning, a deeded boat, a rightful dock, and a family's quiet claim to a half-acre of waterfront nobody ever had the legal authority to take away. It took 11 exhausting months. A stack of documentation thick enough to fill a fireproof box, and one very determined harbor patrol officer reading an old carved name under flashlight to finally prove what should have been obvious from the start. Some things, once rightfully earned, simply cannot be bullied away by anyone holding nothing but a clipboard and false confidence. Sea glass still rocks gently at the same dock tonight. Lines secure, engine quiet, water calm, exactly as Walt always intended it to remain, mine, ours, and never, ever anyone else's to take.